Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for coming. My name is Simone Cavallaro. I'm the director of the Stigler Center here at the booth. We're excited to host Brink Lindsey, Eric Posner, and Glen Weyl for a conversation on their latest books, moderated by Kate Waldock. Unfortunately, Brink's co-author, Stephen Telles, will not be joining us. His flight was canceled last minute. Thank you all for joining us. We are on record and we're live streaming the event, so please silence your phones. As usual, the views expressed by individuals we host are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. As you may know, the Stigler Center promotes and diffuses research on regulatory capture and the various distortions that the special interest group impose on capitalism. We have many initiatives, so please check our website for full details. There is one particular initiative that I'd like to highlight. This year, we released a new podcast, Capitalism, hosted by Stigler Center Director Luigi Zingales and Kate Waldock, on what works on capitalism and what doesn't. If you haven't already, please check it out and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Back to today. We look forward to an insightful conversation on the two books. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Simone. And thank you all for coming today. I'm Kate Waldock. I'm an assistant professor of finance at Georgetown University. And I'm so happy to be here with the authors of two fantastic new books, The Captured Economy, How the Powerful Enrich Themselves, Slow Down Growth, and Increase Inequality, and Radical Markets, Uprooting Capitalism and Democracy for a Just Society. So first I'd like to introduce our authors a little bit more. To my right, I've got one of the authors of The Captured Economy. Brink Lindsey is Vice President and Director of the Open Society Project and the Niskanen Center. Welcome, Brink. Now to my left, I've got the authors of Radical Markets. Glen Weyl is a principal researcher at Microsoft Research and a senior research scholar at Yale University's Economics Department and Law School. Welcome, Glen. And last but not least, hailing from not too far away, we've got Eric Posner. He is the Kirkland and Ellis Distinguished Service Professor of Law and also the Arthur and Esther Kane Research Chair here at the University of Chicago's Law School. Thanks for joining us, Eric. So the way that I see it, for both of you, the authors serve as yins to each other's yangs. So Brink, you are a libertarian, and Steve, who couldn't join us, is a liberal. And Glen, you're an economist. And Eric, you're a legal scholar. So how did you get these projects started?
So for me, although Steve and I present ourselves as coming from different ideological places, in our collaboration, we've converged so much that the distinctions aren't quite as stark as they used to be. But we've been collaborating for nearly a decade on organizing a series of roundtable dinners in Washington, D.C. called the Libertarian Dinner Series.
Have you invited to these dinners?
What's that? I'd love to. I had written a piece a dozen years ago on a kind of breakdown of the long-time political alliances between libertarians and social conservatives. This was during the late Bush years, and the New Republic, where the article appeared, slapped the headline "Libertarians" on top of it, a ungainly label that I've been stuck with ever since. Steve called me up a little bit after that, said, "Hey, I think I may be a libertarian," and we started this dinner series, and then we've been collaborating in ideas ever since. And I had been interested in slow growth and what to do about it, and particularly trying in the current sort of polarized environment to think of transpartisan policy responses that could get buy-in from both sides of the political spectrum. At the same time, Steve had been working on an article for National Affairs about what to do about inequality in polarized Washington, thinking that the way to do something in that environment is to look for transpartisan policy responses that could get buy-in on both sides of the aisle. So me starting with a right of center interest in slow growth and him starting with a left of center interest in inequality came to the same basic sort of package of policy reforms, getting rid of sort of activist government regulation that redistributes upwards. And so having sort of done this coincidentally, we thought that was kind of a sign from God that we should flesh out our efforts into a book, and that's what we did.
Great.
Well, so Glenn was at the Harvard Society of Fellows, and he was coming to Chicago to teach here. And he emailed every single member of the faculty of the University of Chicago to introduce himself and offer to collaborate. University. I'm exaggerating a little bit. And I was the only.
I actually did, Louis.
Yeah, he emailed you.
I did email you.
I was the only person who responded. So I'm exaggerating in both directions. But Glenn, from the beginning, was interested in interdisciplinary collaboration and policy issues. So as someone in the law school who's interested in both of those things, we had a shared interest, and once he got here, we had lunch, and after that became friends. And I think maybe our beginning was a little different from yours, because I think we were just interested in discussing ideas and coming up with things to write about together. And we wrote a number of things before we started writing about the topics that would become this book. And so we did a bunch of papers together, and it was fun. And so this book is the result of that. Do you have anything to add? Is that
what I'd say is that while it was sort of a gradual accretion of ideas, as Eric described it, I think in 2016, both of us were really worried about the state of the world and political discourse and the lack of alternative visions that were sort of up to the moment of Brexit and the Trump election and so forth. And so we felt a social responsibility to, if we could, put our ideas together into some sort of a coherent, publicly accessible form. So,
coming from different perspectives from your co-authors, were there ever any frictions?
Oh, sure. But most, what were more important, though, were the complementarities. I'm a policy wonk and used to thinking about whether policies do what they're supposed to do or not, and kind of thinking about that in isolation. Steve is a political scientist, so he's always viewing policies in terms of how did they get here politically, how do they sustain themselves politically, and putting those my policy expertise with his expertise about how the sausage actually gets made turned out to be a very useful enterprise. Certainly for me, I think about policy in a much more dynamic way than I did before partnering with Steve.
Everything smooth between the two of you?
Well, it was interesting thinking about that. So I have done law and economics at Chicago. And just as Glenn came, I was losing a little bit of interest in economics and writing more about constitutional law. And Glenn really revived my interest in economics and its applications to law. Although at the same time, I learned gradually over the years that Glenn himself is probably more of a skeptic about economics than many economists are. Although you could correct me if that's inaccurate. And then in writing the book, I thought we had agreed about everything because we had, a lot of it was based on previous work we did. But there were big tensions, but I don't think the tensions were ideological. I think the tensions were generational. Glenn are you a millennial? Is that what you are?
Technically, I think, yeah.
So he's a millennial. I don't know, whatever that means. He's young and enthusiastic and optimistic, and I'm more, I think, a little more not like that. And so in actual writing the book, there were these incredible clashes, really more about tone, I think, and sort of, I don't even know how to describe it, but there's a lot of stuff in that book that I was sort of uncomfortable with, especially initially, but I gradually came to like it, although after a lot of back and forth. Yeah.
So I take it the little vignettes at the beginning of each chapter at Glenn's idea?
For example, yes, that was Glenn.
For example, but I'm a little bit of sort of an idealist and maybe even an ideologue in spirit, or an originator, or like into originating ideologies. And Eric is much more sort of like a pragmatist, you might say, or sort of a detail-oriented policy.
Narrow-minded, legalistic grump, I would say.
It sounds like a necessary union. I'd like to take a page out of Kai Ryssdal's book. He's the host of Marketplace by American Public Media.
I just did a podcast with him.
Okay, well, so you know what's probably coming up. So he often asks his guests to describe something in 5 words. And so if you had to describe the problem that you were addressing in your book in 5 words or less, what would those be?
Slow growth and high inequality.
Is that 5? What's slow growth and high? Yeah, okay.
But you reduce that to one word.
Can I we call it stagnant
Inequality,
equality, and minority-majority conflict.
How does the dash count?
Yeah.
Yeah, he got it.
No, you have to come up with your own.
I have to come up with my own. Markets have run out of steam.
All right, I'll let you get away with it. Okay, so let's turn a little bit more to the books themselves. Brink, in your book, there's a lot of discussion of rents. And these aren't necessarily the rents that you pay for a house that you don't own. Can you define a rent for us and tell us more about what causes rents to rise?
Sure. Well, so our, as far as connecting the argument of the book to the motivation is to wonder what's going on with these sort of double whammy melees the U.S. economy is suffering from in the 21st century, the combination of slow growth and high inequality. These are complex phenomena. There's no monocausal explanations for them. What we try to do is to highlight a part of the story that we think has been undertold. So the part that gets more attention are sort of big structural natural forces that are pushing the economy towards slower growth or towards higher dispersion of rewards, skewing of those rewards towards the top. We think those stories have a lot of weight, but they're not the whole story. What we want to focus on are sort of affirmative government actions that make matters worse on both counts. So you can see, if you see inequality sort of as a natural outgrowth of capitalism, then you could see government's failure to respond to it as a sin of omission. But what we are talking about are sins of commission, that active, affirmative regulatory activity that slows down growth and does so in a way that redistributes upwards. What we're talking about there is rent seeking, or what we call regressive regulation. Rents, in economist speak, are excessive returns. That it is as an economic concept, it's a morally neutral term, but in political economy discussions, it's always moralized to talk about bad rents, rents that are a result of artificial scarcity produced by rigging the rules in your favor. Basically, the rent seeking represents a corruption of both democracy and capitalism. So capitalism is supposed to work when markets are supposed to be structured so that entrepreneurs succeed, firms succeed by doing well by their customers. And so private interests and social interests are aligned. Likewise, democracy is supposed to work well when all of the blooming, buzzing confusion of public opinion is filtered through institutional mechanisms that turn those noisy signals into policies that work well for everybody and conduce to the public interest. So rent-seeking misfires both of these systems. Now, when you have rents created by policy, firms can profit at the expense of their customers or at the expense of third parties rather than by serving society. Democracy can be turned from a process of producing policies in the public interest to producing policies in the private interests of the insiders that take over and manipulate the system.
So this idea of regressive regulation, you highlight it in 4 case studies in your book.
Yeah, so we do 4 case study chapters in the book, 2 policies at the federal level, 2 at the state and local level. Tried to get as kind of a diverse group of policies that look like they have absolutely nothing to do with each other. So financial regulation and intellectual property protection at the federal level, occupational licensing and zoning or land use regulation at the state and local level.
Which one was your favorite?
I think the one that's that I learned most about and that I've come to think is at least as important as any of the others is land use and zoning. It doesn't even sound like when we talk about, when Washington talks about regulation and the need for deregulation, it's almost always talking about health, safety, environmental, anti-discrimination regulations, regulations that are costs imposed on existing businesses to serve some social purposes. So that sets up a stock ideological conflict. Business says these regulatory burdens are too high, we need regulatory relief. The people on the left who campaign for these regulations see them as vital social protections, so deregulation to them sounds like stripping those protections away and exposing consumers, workers, and the environment to predations of unchecked corporate power, and you get a solution somewhere in the middle. What we're talking about are completely different kinds of regulations that rather than imposing costs on existing businesses, confer benefits on existing businesses, usually by excluding their potential competitors. That species, so when we talk about deregulation, we're talking about something that typically the business community is going to react hostilely to, as opposed to the deregulation that is the sort of Chamber of Commerce version.
So would you consider yourself a YIMBY?
Yes, yes. So on the land use front, we've had zoning for 100 years. It's been around for a long time. It's always its purpose has always been to affect where housing gets produced and where it gets located, often with exclusionary and nasty social consequences, but not with big macroeconomic consequences until relatively recently. Only relatively recently, with the increasing sort of restrictiveness of these rules and the exhaustion of sprawl opportunities, especially on the coasts, you've seen land use regulation actually affecting the quantity of housing that's getting produced in metro areas by jacking up the prices. So we've had a sort of disconnect between housing costs and construction costs that used to run in sync over the past 30 years or so, especially severe on the coasts. Ed Glazer, an economist at Harvard, has calculated the kind of regulatory tax, the percentage of housing prices that are due to getting the permission to build. In Washington, D.C. and Boston, it's about 20%. L.A. and Oakland is about 30%. In San Francisco, San Jose, and Manhattan, it's 50%. So that produces very high unaffordable housing in those cities. That's a local problem. But the bigger problem is that it deters people who want to move to the most economically dynamic, fastest growing, highest income parts of the country. It deters them from moving there because they can't afford the housing. So over the past generation, we've wound up with a real serious maldistribution of the population. A lot more people should be living on the coasts where the action is than are. Enrico Moretti, an economist at Berkeley, has calculated that if you just brought the land use regulation in New York, San Jose, San Francisco down to median U.S. level, U.S. output would be 10% higher. So that's to find that kind of a maldistribution of resources. That's an eye-popping number for economists, and other economists have come up with comparable kinds of figures. So to think that something as hyper-localistic as zoning is having these sort of whopping consequences on national economic output, that's a big surprise, and it's something that's sinking in now and starting to register intellectually. It's a long slog from here to do anything about it politically.
Right, so that was my next question. How do we rent-proof politics?
When you have bad policies, this is what I've definitely learned from Steve. You have a bad policy-making process. If the output's bad, like if a manufacturing firm they're producing lots of defects coming off the assembly line, you don't just exhort people to do better. You find out what in the manufacturing process is misfiring that's leading to these errors, and likewise, you can see problems with policymaking that lead it into policies that are not in the public interest, especially policymaking venues that are obscure and inaccessible, so that only insiders will tend to show up at the meetings. You see this in occupational licensing with licensing boards. You see this in zoning decisions with tiny little jurisdictions doing lot by lot zoning decisions. You see another form of sort of squid ink that protects insiders is just complexity. Overwhelming technical complexity means only insiders understand what's going on, and even the legislators who are trying to make rules about this stuff have to depend upon the insiders they're regulating because they don't understand it either. These are particularly severe problems in intellectual property and in financial regulation. And then finally, there's just always in these cases organizational mismatch problems. If you've got a narrow concentrated interest, they've got a lot on the line, it's easier for them to organize big dispersed interests that each individual has a nickel at stake that can aggregate up to big dollars, but it's in no individual's interest to band together. So those kinds of Mansur-Olson identified organizational mismatches are always a problem. One way to deal with them is through third-party subsidy, getting philanthropies to ensure that there's somebody else on the other side of the issue is a good way to get things started when there is a huge mismatch. We saw this in the origins of the environmental movement. Big foundations did a lot of the early funding of the whole ecosystem now of environmental organizations, but they got their start through third-party subsidy and continuing third-party subsidies, but that has leveled the playing field a lot more than in the old days when the only people who cared about pollution were the polluters. Likewise, more recently in the educational reform movement, you've had big philanthropies come in and support the charter school movement and have taken a policy space that was completely dominated by teachers' unions and made it much more sort of level. So there are ways to change the political process to make policy decisions more contestable, to open them up to broader input from all affected interests rather than from the narrow group that's looking to make out like bandits.
Glenn and Eric, do you think that these solutions are enough?
So I love the things that Brink and Steve proposed for the most part. I have some slight differences on the financial regulation issue, but in general, I think we're very much on the same page. But Eric, what's your thought about the...
Well, I guess one thing I was thinking was that the worry here is that if you have, two big groups on each side, that they're going to make a deal that will harm whatever third parties are left out of the, who are not participating, and so they'll share the rents, in other words. So it wasn't clear to me, how you thought you would deal with that issue.
So that that happens now in intellectual property law. You have this enormous buildup of patents, which makes every firm potentially vulnerable to other firms that they're potentially infringing every time they do anything. But the way to deal with that is to buy up a huge sort of library of patents, and therefore you can threaten countersuits against the other guy. So the giants build up these enormous sort of defensive patent portfolios just to keep the others at bay, and the ultimate peace treaty that is the sort of non-aggression pacts are cross-licensing deals that the giants all do amongst each other, and then they're all now sort of back in the world where there's no patents anymore. They're all kind of free, but what's excluded are all the little guys that weren't part of those cross-licensing deals that are still excluded. So what we want is not just to have sort of Godzilla and Megalon in the room. We want a third-party representatives of the little guys. So we've just seen in the zoning context these YIMBY groups that have just started to emerge, and they're tiny compared to the NIMBY, not in my backyard interests that have been organized a long time. But it's not necessary. You don't have to have equality of political power in the room to make a big difference. Just having somebody in the room, something other than a complete walkover, often does a lot. Getting, in a lot of these situations, getting the lobbying mismatch from just overwhelming to daunting is a huge improvement and enough to make a big difference in policy outputs.
I guess the example I had in mind, there's a book by Kalmiris and Haber about the financial crisis.
Yeah.
And their argument is that a deal was made between the big banks and groups representing low-income people,
Yes.
under which the big banks would, reduce underwriting standards, and the low-income people would get loans that they wouldn't otherwise get. And it worked great for those groups, at least for the short term. But it also led to these toxic assets that resulted in a financial crisis.
Yeah, so opportunistic deals between interests at the expense of the larger public. That's just that's what happens in Washington D.C. and state capitals everywhere, and it is the besetting ill of democracy. And we can minimize it. We can't get rid of it.
All right, so now for something completely different. The title of your book, Radical Markets, isn't just an exaggeration. You have some pretty radical ideas that can be tough to grasp intellectually when you're seeing them for the first time. So Glenn, could you explain what you mean by a radical market?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. So I just thought it might be useful to take people through a little thought experiment just to sort of open the minds to what we're trying to describe. And so I want to ask people for the moment to put aside all the practical considerations that were like the focus of all the years of work that Eric and I did, and come with me on a journey of imagination to a fictitious city that I'm going to call Marketopia. So unlike Zootopia, Marketopia is not defined by a diverse range of mammals living there, but instead by the fact that in Marketopia, all major private property, let's put aside personal effects like, dogs and cats and, heirlooms and so forth, but all the land and airplanes and so forth are continually up for auction to the highest bidder, who then pays the price that, she bid if she wins to rent these assets from the public. And at any point, someone else might come along and beat her and take over that rent at this new highest bid. And this is not just applied to private goods in Marketopia. In fact, public decisions like where to build a park or what the schools should be like are determined by an auction. But rather than selling it to the single highest bidder, we add up the bids of all the people on the different options, and we choose the option that has the highest total willingness to pay. And all the money that's raised through this auction is continually refunded to every citizen of Marketopia in equal shares as a sort of social dividend, or you could call it universal basic income, like they do with the oil revenue in Alaska and Norway. So when you first think of Marketopia, your reaction may be, this is sort of like the most extreme version of the free market that you can possibly imagine, far beyond anything that Adam Smith could have dreamed of. Because you think of most assets, you realize they're not really on a free market. There's stock markets and there's commodity markets, whatever, but most houses, most businesses, the land of the University of Chicago, there's no price that you could go and pay to get these things. You'd have to enter into some long and awful negotiation process with the current owner where they'd probably charge you way above what they'd be willing to accept once they knew you were interested. Now, once you think of an extreme competitive market like that, you probably imagine the wealthy are just going to beat everybody else out, control every asset, and use it to tyrannize everyone else. But then ask yourself, what do you mean by the wealthy? What it means to have wealth is to own businesses and stocks and land and so forth. And nobody owns those things in Marketopia. In fact, in Marketopia, the value of all assets is equally shared by everyone, and everyone has an equal right to contest for control of those assets. In that sense, it's a far more thoroughgoing and extreme version of the common ownership argued for by people like Karl Marx than is any actual real-world form of socialism, which inevitably degenerates into the tyranny of a small bureaucratic elite that ends up being at least as oppressive as the capitalists that they replaced. So this idea that the extreme version of free markets and the extreme version of communism are sort of one and the same thing sounds crazy to people who grew up after the Cold War, but it was actually a central dogma of late 19th century political economy, especially the thought of this gentleman. Does anyone recognize who this is? So this is Henry George, and he was the best-selling author in the English language other than the Bible for about 30 years. He was incredibly influential in all sorts of ways, but his ideas were largely forgotten during the Cold War when there was this conflict between capitalism and communism. And the idea of the book is to try to bring back that tradition, to argue that it's actually developed within the academy as a field called mechanism design, and to apply it to a broad range of social problems, including the ownership of private property, where we propose a tax that everyone would pay on any assets that they own, based on a value they would assess themselves and have to stand ready to sell at that price. We propose a system of voting where everyone would be allocated equal endowments of voice credits that they could spend on different issues so that minorities could win on issues that are more important to them rather than just one person, one vote, which always has the rule of the majority. A new system of migration where every citizen, rather than just large corporations, could sponsor migrants so that everyone would benefit from more migration. New enforcement of antitrust laws in areas that they've been almost totally ignored, such as against institutional investors that control so much of the economy and against companies that have power not just over their consumers, but over their workers. And finally, the organization of a new, what we call data labor movement, to demand fair compensation for the contributions that every individual makes to the AI systems that are allegedly going to displace your jobs. So that's the basic idea of radical markets. It responds very much to the same concerns that Brink was raising about slow growth, paralyzed and divided politics, and inequality, but tries to maybe go deeper to the roots of what we see as the flaws in the current architecture of markets, which restrains them from being free, not just by what you might call active government interventions, but by things that we take for granted, like property rights and contracts, which themselves, we argue, are monopolistic restrictions in many cases.
Okay, so that's probably perfectly clear to everyone in the audience. But being a little slow, I still need some further exposition.
Absolutely.
So let's say I want to live in a house.
Yeah.
I want to own that house. But actually, who owns it ultimately? Do all of us own it?
Yeah, so under our more detailed proposal, about 2/3 of the value of the house would be owned by the public, and about 1/3 would be owned by you.
Okay.
Now, if you think about that, for most people, that's actually not that different than what happens at present, because most people have a very small fraction of their home value as home equity. So, in reality, it's actually quite similar, except this is a much more efficient system, because under this system, there would always be a price at which you could buy out the houses, which would allow much greater opportunities for economic development. There's a really interesting app that you can look up online called City Builder, which lets you circle collections of houses holding fixed zoning policies and look at how much more valuable they would be if you could obtain all those houses together and use them in some more efficient use. And for typical clusters of blocks, it's like 3x that you could increase the value of land if you were able to actually redraw the boundaries and repurpose it. And that's restrained by the fact that we have such a rigid system of private property that makes it so hard to engage in these potentially value-improving changes.
But if I'm living in my house, I don't want to get kicked out at any moment. How would you prevent that from happening?
Well, the way the cost works, the common ownership, what is the S?
Self-assessed tax.
Self-assessed tax. Well, the self-assessed is the key part. you would declare annually how much you're willing to accept for your house, and you'd be taxed based on that. And if somebody wanted to buy you out, they would have to pay you that amount. And because of on the one hand, you don't want to exaggerate the evaluation because of the tax, but obviously you don't want to understate your valuation because then someone would take your house. So you'll pick a valuation that will fully compensate you for the trouble and discomfort of being removed from the house and would allow you to find another place to live.
Okay, and would there be fixed amounts of time for which you could live in the house and not have to worry about a new auction taking place?
Yeah, those are the details. Those are the sort of the things to be worked out by future generations. But to the extent that there could easily be some delay, so that you don't actually come home one day and find someone else living in your house. But exactly how that should work, what those details should be, we don't try to figure that out in the book.
This concept relies on people knowing values that they would place on an object, on a piece of property. Do you think that people really can value property accurately?
Well, the market is premised, the existing market that we have is premised on the assumption that people can and do every day. So when you buy a house, you're making that valuation. When you do sell it to someone, you are as well. And when you're out in the market buying stocks or bonds or selling your labor, these are calculations that people make all the time. This would require more thought about valuations than one needs to do under the status quo. But it's very much continuous with the way the market already works.
And it offers more information to people in making those decisions. I just bought an apartment in New Jersey, and there were like 3 comparable apartments that had sold in the last 3 years to that apartment that I used to try to think about what the future value might be. Under this system, everything would have some going price. And in fact, the system could be introduced gradually with low tax rates so that people learned from all the information around them to be better at that valuation. That is the reason why it's so much easier to value liquid assets than it is to value illiquid ones. By making everything much more liquid in this world, you would actually make people much more able to engage in precisely that sort of valuation, and you would make it much less high stakes in some important ways because people, values of assets would come down dramatically. So, you wouldn't have to take on as much debt. You wouldn't be at this risk of going underwater if you misestimated the value of something that you purchased. So on the one hand, the role of pricing would become more prominent, but the stakes of pricing actually, paradoxically, would be somewhat lower because the risks involved and the baseline that was put on by the social dividend that this would fund would be much more stable for people.
So you touched on introducing this system practically. If we were, let's say you talk to Donald Trump. He's on board, and so you two are in charge of actually implementing this new system. Given that there is so much inequality today, people would start off on different footing. So how would you get around that problem?
Well, why would that be a problem? I mean, it would be like any proposal to improve a market to make it more efficient. And so people who already have, if there's already, as there always is, differences in wealth, then obviously, that remains a problem. Although this can affect the distribution. Well, this partly solves the distribution of wealth problem. But the point is that if somebody just improves the market so the prices go down and there are more trades, that benefits everybody. It'll particularly benefit poorer people because the prices have come down.
I mean, the other thing I would say is that if Donald Trump called us up today and was interested, we would say, please refer us to your FCC chairman so we can try this out on Spectrum, learn how it works there, see what the pitfalls are, gradually expand it to natural drilling, leases, et cetera. We don't want tomorrow to introduce this system. And in particular, we want to make sure that we start with assets that are disproportionately owned by the wealthy so that we don't start opening up what I would call capitalism for the poor, socialism for the rich. We want to start at the top, open those opportunities up, generate revenue from that benefits everyone, that starts to reduce inequality, and then only then move towards assets that are potentially more contentious.
Yeah, and I want to add also that a vast portion of property in the United States is already publicly owned, including land, of course, but also administrative property of all types. So Glenn mentioned spectrum. But land is a pretty good example because there's all this open space. The government rents, for example, grazing rights to people or mineral rights to companies. So those already are administrative property. They're already sort of rented out, and the public sort of already owns this stuff. So applying these ideas there first would be a very natural thing to do. It would make those markets much more efficient, more private in a way, and then if it worked well, then we could move on to more traditional private property.
Brink, what is your response?
So I think I'm going to focus on this sort of Henry Georgism on steroids idea, which I think is ingenious and has real promise, and particularly starting with spectrum and with publicly owned land and seeing how that goes. I know enough to know that an idea that looks good on paper in a chapter has 4 jillion unanswered questions that will rise up and bite you as you try to implement them. So I can't even hazard to guess what pitfalls are the biggest ones that might lie ahead in implementation. But the idea seems like really fruitful and promising. And I think it has an interesting kind of resonance with the larger project that Steve and I are engaged in. So beyond just focusing on the captured economy, we had this kind of broader policy vision that we call libertarian, which is libertarian on the market side and liberal on the redistribution side. So the idea that there is a kind of connection between freeing up and making and reducing frictions and rigidities in exchange by retreating from a absolutist conception of ownership. That's an idea that we have in common with your idea. So that we see in Washington in the red-blue ideological divide, the sort of size of government in terms of taxing and spending, how much it redistributes, is conflated with how much it regulates the economy, how much it controls economic decision making through government regulation of economic activity. And we would like to separate those two ideas that on the one hand, we think that competitive markets structured so that there's free entry, free exit, free pricing, are immensely fertile engines of social betterment, but that they produce creative destruction, they produce dislocation, that produces demands for protection, demands for security, which, if those demands are not addressed properly, will be addressed by gumming up the works of exchange. So if you don't protect people, if you don't insure them against the hazards of life that happen in a dynamic market economy, you're going to start protecting firms and enterprises and industries, and so deliver a much inferior product of Social Security, and do it in a way that renders the economy less capable of funding social provision. Whereas if you combine a robust, effective social insurance welfare state with a go-go creative destruction market economy, we see those as complementary institutions. The creative destruction pays for the welfare state makes the creative destruction politically sustainable. And so that, I think, at a much sort of closer level of political realism, we're aiming in the same direction as Glenn and Eric are.
On a slightly different bent, against the backdrop of Mark Zuckerberg's recent congressional testimony and what happened with Cambridge Analytica, I was wondering if you could expound a little bit on your ideas on data ownership.
Why don't you?
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay. So our argument is that we should think of data, especially increasingly in the future, as being like labor, like a form of work. And the reason is that everyone's concerned about artificial intelligence potentially displacing human jobs and so forth. But if you think about the way that machine learning algorithms actually work, they're taking data from us and from other people online who label things and so forth, and they're building machine learning systems based on that. Now, you could call that a robot replacing your job, but I would call it something much more akin to, movies replacing live acting. Effectively, it's a mashup of all of our actual contributions that is then making possible this thing that allegedly replaces the need for us, which is sort of just a dishonest way of presenting the whole thing. The truth is that in movies, because of the Screen Actors Guild, because of labor regulations, et cetera, people get a credit, and they get some royalties, and they get protections that come from there being a symmetry of bargaining power there between the studios on the one hand and the actors on the other hand. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than what we get online, where effectively there are no targeted rewards for the actual contributions we make, which is inefficient. It gives people no opportunity to develop themselves in the contributions that they make to the digital economy. It leads to a poor distribution of the income that's coming in. The capital share in these companies is upwards of 80, 90%, which is just crazy compared to the rest of the economy. You think of Walmart, for all the labor issues they have and all the people who attack them, they're paying about 70, 80% of their value added out to workers. And Facebook and Google are paying 10, 15% out to workers because there's this whole workforce that they have that they're not paying. So the idea that we have is to use the same sorts of tools updated to the modern era that the labor movement used, a combination of updated labor regulation that actually fits this environment, strong protections for the ownership over the property rights in data and the labor rights in data, a labor movement, and competition from companies that have a different interest. Microsoft, where I work, obviously makes quite a bit of money off of Bing, which has a similar model to Facebook and Google, but we're also a productivity company. And if people come to view themselves as producers and not just consumers online, we hope that they would trust Microsoft as a potential partner in that. And we might therefore have a different interest in the long term than Facebook and Google have in sort of convincing people to surrender their data for free.
I would push back against this notion that it's free, though.
Yeah.
I mean, in exchange for putting my pictures up on Facebook, I get to know all my friends' birthdays, and I get to let my friends know what my status is.
Yeah.
So I do get compensated in that way, and I think most people actually feel like that is sufficient compensation.
Yeah, so I think the question in my mind is less, at a broad level, are we getting something out of the digital economy or not? But rather, in a targeted, specific way, for the contributions that we make that end up being most valuable to them, are we getting a targeted, specific reward for that? And the failure to do that, or the failure to even inform us and make it clear all the productive ways in which our data is being used, is, I think, undermining the productivity of this economy and not just the distribution of outcomes there. So, for example, Facebook might be using the labels that you put on the photographs to train an emotion recognition system. But, it gets that by sort of making you think it's cool to use all these different potential labels for your photographs. If they just said, I'd really like to know X, would you mind doing that for me, and paid you correspondingly, we would, I think, in the long term, once we had a good reputation system and trust and so forth, get far higher quality inputs to artificial intelligence. We'd get much better artificial intelligence. It's just that Facebook and Google are getting a great deal not paying us for any of that stuff, so they don't want us to be aware of all the productive ways in which they're using our data, and that's what we need to change. We need to build awareness. We need to get what I called somewhere else cyber woke, and demand compensation for all of the value that we're creating, so that we can be more productive, so that we can have a greater sense of dignity, and so that we can get a better distribution of the rewards from the economy.
The last question that I want to ask has to do, I guess, broadly and philosophically with the nature of change.
Yeah.
Some of the changes that you're proposing are quite radical. Some of the changes that you're proposing are more incremental. A lot of people think that in the United States we have a political system that's not meant to change quickly. It's specifically designed for slow change. So would it even be possible? I mean, you touched on kind of the introduction of the spectrum, but is radical change even possible here in the US, and is it the time for it right now?
I think, well, so as Glenn mentioned before, we're not revolutionaries in the sense of saying that we should man the barricades right now or rewrite the Constitution. We're incrementalists in the sense that we think the government and people should experiment with these ideas before implementing them on a broad scale. Where I think the ideas are radical, they're more like endpoints to strive for over time. And I think the way I think about it is that these ideas, while they're presented as normative proposals, they also help, make it easy to understand what's wrong with the current system and how to fix it, the directions that need to be taken for them to be fixed. So I don't think there's anything in our system that prevents the type of change, the proposals that we make. It may be that you need more of a crisis or more of a sense of crisis before there's enough motivation to try some of these things. But I think there aren't really any constitutional barriers that I can think of to our proposals, or at least the core ideas at the proposals. So the main thing to do is to try to persuade people, and if that happens, then I think change can take place.
So first, I'd just like to say that there's just not nearly enough brain power devoted to zero-based budgeting, organizational and institutional innovation, and the idea of coming up with several breathtaking novelty in institutional design that you've come up with in a single book is great, and I would love to have a world where we were set up to give these things a try in an easier way. As far as sort of how ambitious should you be, every reformer of any stripe is to that extent a utopian. You are envisioning a world that does not exist, and you're living in that world in your head, and you're trying to get everybody else to come with you and come populate it, and you usually end up somewhere else. But hopefully you've gone in the right direction. I think as far as how we see the context for the reforms we're pushing, we think the crisis is here. The problems I had never devoted a minute's thought to, namely the sort of long-term viability and integrity of America's liberal democracy, are on my mind a lot these days, and that is because our political system against the backdrop of a rising discontent, I think because of stagnant equality, to use a word even uglier than libertarian.
It's meant to be ugly.
To me, it feels like that if, well, just to put it bluntly, we've elected a completely unfit demagogue as president. For that to happen, for such a thing to occur, that means a profound loss of faith in governing elites and established institutions. You don't go making these kind of crazy, desperate choices if folks who are normally in charge have the confidence of the public. So the mere fact that this has happened has to be a profound failure of governing elites. And so the first step in responding to this kind of spasms of populism that are leading to openings for demagogues is to recognize that we do have real structural problems, that our institutions are not delivering the goods in a satisfactory way, and that is causing real discontents that are burbling up in really dysfunctional ways. So a lot of people know that they're having trouble keeping their heads above water, while a relatively small portion of the population's doing immensely well. They saw 10 years ago some of those incredibly well-heeled people do a lot of stupid things that nearly drove the entire global economy off a cliff. They didn't see any of those people pay a very stiff price for their misdeeds, while they may have lost their homes in the process. So this sense in the public that the system is rigged is not a sentiment that's restricted to Trump supporters. It was very evident in the strong response to Bernie Sanders' campaign on the left. Steve and I are here to say that this inchoate public sense that the system is rigged is right. The system is messed up. We have structural problems in our polity that are making it where some people are getting massive ill-gotten gains, and other people their life opportunities are shriveled as a result. And so the goal is to take this real justified anger and resentment and turn it away from the scapegoats that demagogues come up with. It's blame it on Mexicans, blame it on Muslims, and turn it towards the actual problems, the actual policy dysfunctions that are causing stagnant equality, and by so doing, to demonstrate that liberal democratic governance can work and can be effective. That, I think, is the only effective, ultimately the only effective response to populism is effective liberal democratic governance. And so the motivation is here right now. Whether we're up to the challenge of responding to it remains to be seen.
Just one thing I wanted to add, and I'm not sure I agree whether Eric and I agree on this or not, but I think a big purpose of what we're trying to do with these ideas is to get an alternative vision for the future out there. That doesn't mean that in the near term we want to immediately implement these extreme policies without careful testing. Of course we don't. But I actually think to achieve the sorts of things that Brink and Steve are talking about, we need public accountability, we need public engagement, we need things that capture people's imaginations, we need new ideologies that break apart the current discourse. Without something that can really grab people, that can inspire young people to really think about things differently, I think we're going to struggle to achieve any of the things that we want, because beyond just the mechanics of politics, we need genuine public engagement and genuine belief in alternatives that are possible. And so that is in many ways my greatest hope with this. And I've been amazed by the reaction we've gotten from students to these ideas, the way that it captures their imagination, even though they're hard to understand. In some ways, actually, the younger people are, the less experience they have, the easier they find it to understand them, because they're not actually that complicated ideas. They're just very different. And we hope that by giving a hopeful vision of something different, or at least I hope by giving a hopeful vision of something different, we can change the shape of politics and make possible both the things that Steve and Brink are talking about and the incremental things that will eventually lead towards the types of ideas we're advocating.
So speaking of young people's ideas, as well as old people or older, I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. Yes, Ms. Shepard?
My question is to Eric and Glen. Wait for the microphone, please. Oh. Sorry. Thank you.
Yes, my question is to Eric and Glen. It seems, at least to me, that your proposals are based on the assumption that economic agents, like households, are quite rational. Could you please comment if you think that is indeed a critical assumption? And if it is, how reasonable is it?
Well, so Glenn has written a separate paper about the extent to which quadratic voting, one of the proposals, depends on some narrow or very high level of rationality, and you can talk about that if you'd like. The basic point I want to make here is that if you support markets in general, you have some kind of baseline assumption that people are reasonably rational and they're able to make decisions. You still want some regulation to protect people, and we're not opposed to regulation of that type. But there's no reason to think that our proposals require people to be more rational than they are required to be under the existing market system.
I basically agree with what Eric said, but I would just give one example of that, which is, look, yeah, if under the cost you misvalued things, some bad things could happen to you. But in our society, if bad things happen to you, you end up out in the cold with no job prospects and no source of income. Under our system, you would have a social dividend to fall back on that would, cushion people against the sources of the worst potential outcomes. And there would be much more information available along a number of dimensions. So I actually think our system, while it does absolutely harness the power of individual rationality, which we do believe in, otherwise we should have a central planner or something taking care of everything, it also gives people something to fall back on to allow for that dynamism to play itself out.
In the back.
So you talked about that we are also kind of laborers of data. And generally the Chicago tradition of law has considered in antitrust the role of consumer welfare. And you have proposed in your previous works about workers' welfare and so forth. So how do you think the existing paradigm of antitrust and regulation should be changed and can be changed? Are you proposing a new paradigm?
I don't think it's a new paradigm. We've gotten this response a lot, and there does seem to be this widespread view that courts and other antitrust authorities take account only of consumer welfare and ignore worker welfare. But it's just not correct. There have been labor monopsony cases recognized by courts for decades. And the consumer welfare standard in antitrust law is oriented toward a particular issue, but there's no view, as far as I've been able to ascertain, among the courts or most academics that only workers' welfare would be excluded. The point of antitrust law is to make markets more efficient, and you want to make them more efficient on the labor side as well as on the product market side.
Richard?
Hi, so I'm wondering about, one thing that strikes me about this idea is it strikes me as being very American in the sense of moving towards private property or gaining at least some ownership of public assets in private hands. So I just wanted to draw your attention or hear what you think about, there's other models, for example, in Canada where there are still publicly owned assets like airports that are privately managed. And these seem to be working fairly well. So I just wanted to ask you why your idea would work better than that, or if it would.
Well, I mean, there's a role for public ownership. At least I think the government should continue to own military assets. I don't know whether Glenn, you agree? You haven't thought about that. He'll let you know. And we're not taking a position on whether there's some things that shouldn't be owned by the government. Our focus is actually on the other side, on private ownership, which we think is inefficient in a range of circumstances, and how to make that better. Now, I use this example in response to an earlier question about the enormous ownership of public lands and spectrum and so forth. And the view in among academics is that the government's management of these institutions is extremely bad, and frequently it's just imitating what the market does. And so this is an area in which the cost system could be used without sacrificing the reasons that people think these are appropriate for public ownership in the first place. That, for example, people might monopolize these lands or exploit them. But there could be plenty of places where you still want to maintain public ownership. I don't disagree with that. There are also a million types of public-private partnerships and things like that. I mean, we don't really survey them, and I guess our focus is not on these sorts of arrangements, which may well work well in certain circumstances. We're at a kind of a higher level of generality.
And quadratic voting would enable those things, and is it designed to make public decision-making more efficient?
Right, I guess if you have quadratic voting making public decision-making more efficient, you can have more government-owned property as well. So.
One thing I just want to say, we had this issue at Google yesterday when I gave a talk. It would be great if we could get a more diverse range of people asking questions, if it's at all possible. I don't know if there's any women that would be interested in asking questions or anything like that? Oh, great.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a small question, which is the data labor, does that mean that AI should necessarily be should not be privatized. And the second question speaks to this problem of crisis, or the lack thereof, that I think Professor Posner spoke of. What I don't really understand is who are you speaking to? Because it seems like you're trying to persuade governing elites that these ideas and proposals would be beneficial to them, but that runs contrary. They are the very people incentivized not to accept these. I don't know what kind of middle class or working class person wouldn't accept this data as labor provision, for example. But it seems the real problem is that the governing elites are incentivized to not adopt the proposals. And there is where the lack of crisis is felt, not on the other end. So how do you incentivize governing elites to accept these kinds of proposals, which seem to run contrary to the status quo?
Do you want to speak to the first one?
You go ahead. Yeah.
What should AI be private or not? That's a very interesting question. I don't think data as labor speaks to that directly. I think it tries to address the current ownership structure, whether eventually there's so much concentration in these technology industries that they can't remain in private hands. I think that's an interesting question. I think personally on that issue, I feel differently about different things. I personally feel that Facebook is basically a utility and probably should be nationalized or something like that. And I think the same is probably true of Uber. But some of these other things, it's much less clear to me. They're much more complicated, and there's a lot of innovation there and so forth. And I'm not quite sure how you should think about those. But I'm sure that I have no idea if those are Eric's views on those particular issues.
Me neither.
On the issue of, I think that's a fabulous question about the nature of the different groups that we're trying to persuade. And I think that there's a complex dance, at least from my perspective, in what we're trying to do, which is one core goal of the book is to take the rhetoric of free markets away from elites, because we think that that's been incredibly important to defending established privilege. And if we can successfully undermine that argument, if we can say to those who defend existing endowments that you're not an advocate of the free market, you're an advocate of monopoly, I think that will be an incredibly powerful tool. But at the same time, every revolutionary movement has to have some sort of a vanguard. And I don't think that vanguard, to some extent, it's existing elites because we want people to experiment and so forth. But even more, it's students, it's young people. And this book, more than I had hoped, I think actually does speak to a pretty broad audience. I've talked to lots of people in lots of circumstances that can really get into the ideas. And in fact, sometimes the less educated they are, the easier it is for them to get into the ideas and to see deep inside of the structures. So I'm hopeful that we can inspire a new generation of people who can be intellectual leaders, artists, and other things who can convey this to a broader audience. So.
Eric, anything to add?
Yeah, you do have to have some faith that ideas matter.
I do. I'm an intellectual.
Okay, but if you look throughout history, Adam Smith, Henry George, all these people, they proposed ideas that were contrary to the interests of the elites at the time, and but they gained influence among intellectuals and then brought more broadly, and so I don't, I'm not. I don't think we have to propose something that's sort of in the immediate self-interest of the elites. That may not be necessary.
Right, but in Adam Smith's case, for example,
Yeah.
Adam Smith has been used so perniciously in a way that nobody remembers what he said. He
Right.
was totally opposed to profiteering interests, and he's been
Right. He was a radical, right? We talk about him. We try to revive his reputation. Bring back his real reputation as a radical who hated the privileged special interests who controlled things. So he had his influence over time, but the people with the money, they didn't like what he was saying. Well, now they do, right? Because that's why there has to be the second wave of market thought, I guess. Yeah.
So, I know that there's still a lot of questions out there, but hopefully you'll get the chance to speak to the authors directly. Radical Markets and the Captured Economy, two incredibly innovative and thought-provoking books. I recommend them to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here today.